You can now find me on RoadStr, the app connecting people through cars. Follow me there to be the first to know about my upcoming plans. Hello everybody, I'm James, and today on the channel I'm driving one of Japan's strangest cars, the Toyota Corolla T Sport. I know what you're thinking, James, that's a Corolla, as Toyota are keen to keep reminding us all the world's best-selling car. It's about as far from strange as you could possibly get, particularly given the wild and wacky stuff that has come out of Japan in the past. However, I do believe that is not as bold a claim as it may seem, and now I'll tell you why. The 1990s and early 2000s were really a bit of a golden age for fans of the hot hatch. I regrettably have only really recently come to truly appreciate the pleasures of a hatchback. In my younger days I was really more of a coupe or saloon person, influenced I'm sure by my parents' choices of cars, as many of us were. At the turn of the millennium, if you wanted yourself a practical, daily drivable car with a little bit of performance, the world was your lobster. We had things like the Peugeot 306 GTI6, the Citroën Saxo VTS, later things like the Vauxhall Astra and Corsa VXR, the Ford Focus ST and RS, and perennial favourites like the Volkswagen Golf GTI. Even outsiders like Proton gave the quick hatch thing a go. Considering Toyota at several points in the past has been the world's largest car company, you would have thought it was an absolute no-brainer for them to make one as well. Yet when they introduced the T Sport in 2003, the motoring press couldn't help but scratch its head and wonder what Toyota had been smoking. The recipe for a hot hatch, after all, is a fairly simple one. You take a relatively ordinary car, you give it a spicier engine, a lowered suspension, a slightly firmer ride, a few little bits of token aero addenda, perhaps a stripe or two if you're feeling very fruity, some larger alloy wheels, a bigger, sexier looking and sounding exhaust, and maybe some buckety Recaro seats. Then you set it free and watch as the sales rack up. However, Toyota, and I cannot say whether for complacency, arrogance or mere indifference, didn't think that those rules applied to them. And the 2003 Corolla T Sport was almost literally a regular Corolla with a hot engine dropped in. The engine bit they certainly got right. Up front you'll find a 1.8 litre 4-cylinder with 16 valves, codenamed 2ZZGE. It's best known to many as the engine which went in the Lotus Elise for quite some time, including the Federal Elise and the 111R, of which I owned an example. It suits a car like a Lotus to a T. It's compact, it revs high, 8,200 RPM, and had development from Yamaha, so it's got real pedigree. Total power output is around 190 horsepower, torque is about 133 pound-feet, that's 180 newton meters, and it's connected to a 6-speed gearbox, and driving, as you'd expect, the front wheels only. That engine also made an appearance in the 7th generation Celica, and I have to say, it is an engine with which I have a bit of a love-hate relationship. There is no doubt that Honda's K20 is an absolute masterpiece, and this has many of the same things people love about the Honda. It revs north of $8,000, and if you want the best from it, you really do have to take it all the way around the clock. Helping you do that is a manual gearbox that I have to say is a real highlight. It has a very short positive action and is a joy. And it's just as well that the gearbox is so nice, because one of the biggest problems with this engine is that the VVT-Li crossover, the equivalent to VTEC, happens at over 6,000 RPM, giving you just 2,000 RPM worth of full power. And that's problematic because unless you change up at the very last moment, within the last 50 RPM, in the next gear, you'll then find yourself out of VVT-Li. This means for making overtakes or even just modest progress, it can be a little bit frustrating because, unsurprisingly, when you're not in the zone, this engine really doesn't have all that much to give at all. When you then combine that with the fact that the original T Sport didn't really have anything different about its chassis or body, and it's no surprise that people were more than a little bit disappointed with Toyota. Clearly, somebody listened, because a couple of years later, in 2005, the car was facelifted. Not only did it get a minor but appreciated visual tweak, they also made some mechanical changes. So at long last it got a lower, firmer suspension, dropped by about 20 millimeters. It also got faster steering, down from 3.5 turns lock to lock to 3.2. Today's car has been brought to me by its kind owner, Sinjin, who's had it now for about a year. It's his second car, he's 25, and it replaces a Ford Puma, which he also greatly enjoyed. He spent some time seeking out an example which, in his words, hadn't had all the usual hot hatchback stuff done, so he wanted something very standard. So much so that when the old exhaust rusted through, he replaced it with an OEM item. And actually, I quite like the sound of it. It's very well judged. It still sounds pretty fruity when you're on it, but it's not too raucous, it's not unsettling, and that means if you do want to do big miles in the car, you can without going deaf. And he has done big miles in this car, taking it up to Scotland a number of times. The sole modification to this car has been the deletion of the snorkel on the airbox. He says that as far as he could tell, it hasn't really harmed the engine in any way, but has let a little bit more of that induction noise come through. 3-point turn hill start torture test. There are no parking sensors on this car, that's just the warning to say that you're in reverse. Turning circles actually also not that bad, not always a given on a hot hatch. And this is a car I'm actually liking an awful lot more than I thought I might. Before I explain why though, let's give it some beans. My expectations of this car were that the engine was going to be a real firecracker when on song, but the rest of the time it was going to be a damp squid, and the chassis would have little to nothing in the way of redeeming features. I was fairly wrong. What this car is rather nicely balanced, and it's for that exact reason I'm sure a lot of people didn't like it. Let's take the suspension. It's not the firmest thing in the world, but it does have very decent body control. It does move a fair bit over these more difficult road sections. There is quite a bit of roll in it, and on track I'm sure that would really count against it. In the real world, what this means is that the car deals with imperfections in the road surface surprisingly well. The steering, similarly, it's not the last word in feel and feedback, but the weighting is beautiful. Compared to some of the old Honda racks, particularly the electric ones you found in stuff like the EP3 or even my S2000, you have more of a sense of genuine connection with the road surface. Those always felt a little bit digital. This feels genuinely analog, in a good way. The gearing is annoyingly long. If you do want to wring the engine's neck, then it is enjoyable. By the time you've moved into third, you've already hit 60. Quite different to the Panda 100 horsepower I drove the other day, where when you came to 60, you were already moving into fifth. We do currently have an airbag warning light, and Sinjin says that's been plaguing him for a bit because he's taken it to 2 specialists now, tried to have the codes read, and it isn't actually giving any. Beyond that though, the car has happily been very good to him. It hasn't broken down, hasn't really even given him a hint that it may be any trouble whatsoever, and for an engine that's fairly stressed, that's quite nice to know. He's also been doing the sensible thing. He's done oil changes ahead of schedule at around 6,000 to 7,000 miles, and I would recommend that to anyone thinking about buying a car with this engine. He's also changed the gearbox oil, something that isn't part of the service schedule. And although it wasn't the cheapest car to get done, the last service bill was about 400 quid, that's still not horrendous. All of the boring stuff is of course shared with the Corolla of the same generation, and given how common they were, trying to find those bits is not going to be expensive or difficult. Even fuel is better than you might expect. The current average on the trip computer here is just shy of 28 to the gallon, but on the motorway he'll get nearly 40. Insurance is also a pleasant surprise. While your mileage will certainly vary, Sinjin is 25 and he pays only £400 a year for this. That's really good for an old Japanese hot hatch, because they don't have the best of reputations. Were he to try and buy a Civic Type R, I would expect it to be a little bit more. In terms of the other boring stuff, the interior really isn't going to win any awards. The EP3 certainly feels like the more special car to be in. The quality of plastics and materials is the same in both of them. It's not particularly good, but that's also not a worry. However, because you sit a little bit lower in the Honda, it has that funky dash-mounted gear lever, and the whole shape of the thing is a little bit distinct. It does feel a little bit more bespoke. This, if you're not giving it hell for leather, does have the feeling of a Corolla. The driving position is a little bit higher than I would like it. These seats are very nice. They're half leather and half Alcantara or suede or suede-ish, something like that. The stereo is pretty boring, doesn't work very well, and it's got a little FM transmitter down here to give the car some basic Bluetooth functionality. There is 2-zone climate control though, and in the back you've actually got a reasonable amount of room too. I can sit myself, behind myself, with plenty of space. It's not uncomfortable. The boot is also a very good size as well, and one of the best things about this car, he says, is it's the sort of thing where if you want to take your grandmother out to tea, she'll get in it, you'll drive it, and she'll never know it's anything beyond a nice, safe, sensible, boring Toyota. But then, once you've dropped her off and you want to get home quickly, you can have a lot of fun. It is no real surprise that the engine is one of the best things about this car. However, as far as I'm concerned, it's also the worst thing about it. You see, whereas the rest of it has a real sense of balance, the engine is a total Jekyll and Hyde. If they had the crossover just a little bit lower, even say 5,500 RPM, my own Elise had an ECU modification to take it to 5,800 RPM, it would make a tangible difference. But with this kind of car, if you're not that experienced and you're trying to do a quick overtake or something like that, it's very, very easy to get things wrong. Not only that, but the last 2,000 RPM in a car like this is always very addictive, and so it's really easy to be suckered into trying to chase that red line, extract every last piece of performance that the engine has to offer. However, sometimes that means you're not paying full attention to what's going on up ahead. I've nearly got myself in trouble a couple of times with things like the S2000 or even the old Sleeker, because you get so focused on trying to find out just how much it's got to give, you don't quite realise what's coming up. The brakes in here are also pretty decent, and unlike in my Elise, to heel and toe is actually quite simple. The pedals in the 2005 to sort of 2007 Elise were just not set up right, so heel and toe was nearly impossible. Despite the improvements being made in 2005, these still never sold particularly well, as evidenced by the fact that today on Auto Trader there are only 6 for sale. They also offered, as with the Elise, a supercharged version of this car, which was introduced at the same time as the facelift. One of those I'd be very keen to try, and on a number of occasions I've considered buying one as a daily driver, but I simply couldn't find one and was a little bit concerned that it might not be the kind of car I want to spend big miles in. Having had the Elise, and that being a very unpleasant thing to be on the motorway, I was worried the Toyota would be a bit similar. As it happens, I needn't have worried. And if the Toyota engine is anything like the Lotus one, and I'm sure it is, the supercharged version doesn't really give you a huge amount more torque, which I know is what people would expect. But what it does mean is that the car is a lot more linear, so you no longer feel that crossover at 6,000 RPM. The car just makes clean power all the way. Sinjin brought me his car today because he felt like history has done the T Sport a little bit of a dirty. In truth, I think Toyota did a lot of that themselves because they couldn't really even be bothered to give it proper badging. T Sport does just sound like a trim level and not a whole other model. And their first attempt, being so half-hearted, I think utterly destroyed any chances that the facelifted version had. In terms of durability, if properly looked after and well serviced, these engines seem to be fairly dependable. That's not to say that they don't break, and in the Lotus world it's not unheard of. However, that tends to be for cars that are used on track, and if you do want to take one of these and do that kind of thing with it, a baffled sump is certainly a piece of kit I would highly recommend. As it stands though, the facelifted T Sport, I think, makes a very compelling purchase. And with examples in the classifieds now at anywhere between £1,500 and £5,000, they still seem to be a relatively affordable car to get into. I'm not convinced they're ever going to be a future classic because they simply didn't have the love when they were new. But for those on the hunt for a bargain, that's only ever a good thing. There we have it, a little bit on a somewhat overlooked Japanese performance car. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. I want to say a big thank you to Sinjin for bringing his car out. Please like, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye bye.